So the exploitation of beads came to bring a lot of people from Mexico, particularly because they were tougher and they were willing to work for less than many people here in Minnesota. It's a very tough work, by the way, because you can be hurt, and so many people ended up just losing their feet because they need to use an instrument to cut the low, and so many times they are working very close to each other, and one was just cutting the feet of the other. So it was very dangerous. Still, a lot of people came here. By 1917, before that time, the United States government imposed policy just asking for taxes for the people who were immigrated to this nation. But Mexicans were exempted for them to cross the border easily. So the thing is that they were labor force that were very welcome everywhere. So they didn't need to pay this tax to come in and work in here. And they, as I was saying before, they ended being in the beads exploitation fields. They became very famous because of that. In Mexico, they were known as betabeleros because they were cutting the beads. So, they were really famous. If they worked first at the beginning in the rural area, later on they moved into St. Paul area. So what is now West St. Paul was the first kind of big colony of immigrants from Mexico, or Latino barrio. And by 1927, a survey recorded 125 Mexican people living in Minneapolis, but also the number was almost double in St. Paul. Even the St. Paul Flats, who were very famous for European immigrants living in there, ended being more inhabited now by Mexican people. The grocery stores and other Mexican manifestations of the culture appeared here in the state, and actually they became more famous than Irish, Italians, and Eastern European people because, well, Mexicans are colorful and noisy. So everybody was looking at them and going to the grocery stores. So they replaced all those other people because they were not kind of mixing clearly with the native people here in the state. You know, near the railroads there are a lot of houses who are inhabited by people from Mexico or with Mexican origin. And then Mexicans became part of the neighborhoods that started working the whole year, not only during the time in which it was possible to work with the bead fields, but now the entire year. They start to create kind of a urban culture in St. Paul particularly. And in 1918, first Mexican colonia was created in St. Paul. Today you can go there and you'll see a lot of reminiscences of it, but not necessarily the same kind of style. And before the Second World War, it was a point of reference. So many people went to say, do you want to know Mexico? Go to St. Paul, West St. Paul, because there are so many Mexicans in there. And I can say the same today, because if you go to El Burrito Mercado, you might have a piece of Mexico there. So you can also learn about it. For the first time in the mid-century, Mass in Spanish wasn't common in the area, particularly in the area of the what is today Guadalupe Church. It's a very famous point of concentration for people who are going to Masses every Sunday. So many people back then in time were kind of betting that Latinos were going to stay out of the picture after the Great Depression because they were not going to be needed anymore. So the Depression was demanding cheap labor force to keep this country ongoing. But they stayed here. They are stubborn, so they stayed here. And because of that, the population started growing because of fertility. And the growth was kind of noticeable. It was really big. By 1940, the Latino community in Minnesota was entirely visible. And also in West Side St. Paul and the small areas inside South Minneapolis, a lot of people from Mexican or Latino origin were there. Mexican Americans also, they were started living there, so Chicanos. So you might really see not only Mexicans, but also Chicanos living all together. Later on, even more than 700 Mexican soldiers from Minnesota were sent to the war fields representing the United States, or fighting for the United States, because they were born in the United States, U.S. citizens. So they enlisted themselves into the army to fight within the Second World War. But this is a story that is not really openly told. But 700 is a significant number. Now, this is pretty much what I want to underline here about how immigration has changed from 1870, I can say, through 1910. The population of Minnesota were coming from all these countries, particularly Germany, Norway, and Sweden. And guess what? Almost 65% of them were undocumented here in Minnesota. So, and they were not a problem. I mean, that is really important to know. By now, particularly from 1990, we do have several people from Mexican origin particularly, and we are going to see later on in a table that it is the largest number of immigrants today, but it's closely followed by refugees from the monks and Somalis particularly, because the state is very generous in that sense with refugees. But Mexicans are here representing a very new kind of wave of immigration. Here is a map that was built just to show where most of the immigrants are coming from Mexico to Minnesota, because there is a small town near Mexico City, in Cuernavaca. It's Axochiapan, and it's sending almost 70 to 80% of its male population to the state of Minnesota. So it is a very strong network that it is coming all together, and you'll see all the road they are following. But bottom line here, and this is really important to point out, many people are going first to Texas or even to California, and then following a road up north to Minnesota. Many of them are staying there in Texas for generations, and then moving to Minnesota. So that is really important that Minnesota is not receiving but a few percentage only direct immigration from Mexico. But they are going first to some other states and then coming to Minnesota. And we are still trying to figure out why. Because it's too cold here. So between 1942 and 1966, there was a new wave of Latino immigration, which was based upon the Bracero program. The Bracero program was made after the Second World War because the United States was losing a lot of labor force going to the fields in the war in Europe. They needed labor force here. And they couldn't find, and they didn't rely too much on female labor force. They didn't think that females were able to really produce as much as men. So they brought a lot of people from Mexico under this program, the Bracero program, to work particularly in plants everywhere in the United States, but Detroit, for example, and later on Chicago, were highly favored for people in business who needed this labor force. So that increased a lot of people, increased a lot of number of people who came to the States. However, most of them were coming from the southern border because they were there already. So it was easier to transport them from Texas, from California, or New Mexico, or even Arizona to these northern parts, rather than bring them from Mexico. And with that, we do have kind of a new mix of culture occurring here in the state of Minnesota, because we did have what was the Mexican origin culture now mixed with what was the Chicano culture. And that created something really interesting, that it is going to end in a more open kind of manifestation of cultural aspects here in Minnesota. The Pan American Festival, who was created by the 40s, became more important than St. Patrick's Day. And today you know about Cinco de Mayo, for example, and it's very, very important here in Minnesota, to my surprise, because for Mexicans it's just a bottle and it didn't mean too much. But for Mexicans here, it's a lot. It has a very significance. And also, the University of Minnesota created from there the Chicano Studies, who was the first regional Chicano Studies department created, upon this importance of the Mexican Americans in the state of Minnesota. The Mexican Americans became more assimilated, and then the Minnesotan showed a new face. And I have a couple of pictures that I can talk about because I didn't include it in my presentation. But the brown berets, who were really famous in Los Angeles, for example, were original from the state of Minnesota. Later on, they were embracing the movement from Cesar Chavez and all these big figures of the Chicano movement. Well, the brown berets were really created in the state of Minnesota. So that is really important. So bottom line, this is a precedent of what is today in Minnesota with the Latino population. So today we do have a clear picture of a more colorful, not so white Minnesota. But still, I mean, we Latinos represent scarcely 5% of the entire population of the state. So we haven't yet covered the entire state properly, but we are going for that. And now Barbara is going to talk about the numbers, 2010. But later on, I can just come back to say some things about what are the characteristics of this population. I tried to read this.
Is there a light?
Yeah, he does.
This one?
No.
No, I didn't need her.
This is the one. Shake it over. Yeah.
All right. Okay. It just occurred to me today that we got the session right after lunch, which is always, it's kind of a challenge to keep everybody awake. And then, never having spoken with Rodolfo before, I didn't realize I was also following a Mexican comedian. So here I am. After all of that fun stuff, I get to tell you about numbers. Latinos in the last decade were the fastest growing population in Minnesota. And they grew about 62% between 2000 and 2010, more than doubling in the previous decade. And if we go back, actually if we go, I think that's on the next slide, sorry, I'm not seeing very well. So we had an increase of over 100,000 Latinos in the last decade. And as Rodolfo said, there's always some undercount. I haven't seen any data on undercounts from the 2010 census. We were quite pleased with the results of the census with the response rates in Minnesota, but you always miss a few people, so it's hard to know how many more there might be. And while we talk about concentrations of Latinos in greater Minnesota, in places like Worthington and Wilmer and St. Cloud and Austin, actually 2/3 of Latinos in Minnesota live in the Twin Cities metropolitan area, the 7 counties covered by the Metropolitan Council. Where is it? Which do I do? Oh, this one? This one? Oh, that way. We can just do it this way.
Yeah, shake it, yeah.
Oh, that's not right. So not only do I get the place behind the comedian and lunch, I break the technology. Okay. I think so. All right. Oh, you okay? Okay. This is just a graph that shows you how many Latinos, according to the census, were here in 1980, 1990, 2000, and 2010. And you see the huge increases over these decades. One of the things that is tricky about the census is that they change the definitions periodically. Since 1980, we've had the same definition of Hispanic or Latino population. And we don't want to go any further back than that because we don't have the exact same definition. When Rodolfo was talking about the 1860 count of Mexicans, that's what we were counting, was Mexicans. We weren't counting Latinos or Hispanics. That came about much later. The same thing is true in the Asian population. But you can see the rapid increase from 90 to 2000 and then again in the last decade. So a very, very rapidly growing population and becoming an increasingly larger percentage of the total. Are we ready to turn? Oh, is that going to work?
I don't know. I didn't.
Oh, we're here. Somehow we got to this map.
Do that.
I'm gonna be there.
I don't know where we are.
Sorry.
We're gonna need this,
All right, let's go to the next slide. Excellent. All right, this is just a change of population in the Latino population by county between 1990 and 2000. And sometimes percentage increase can be somewhat misleading because in very small counties with very small numbers, the percentage may be much larger than in a large county like Hennepin County or Stearns County, where the numbers are larger but the percentage may be smaller. So you need to be a little bit careful about that. Whoever's got control. There we go. This past decade between the census in 2000 and 2010, total increase was 62%, and you can see that there was an increase in almost every county except Grant County in west central Minnesota. And again, those population percentage versus numbers. And this is the 20-year change. In Koochiching County, you saw the only place with a decrease, and Koochiching County actually decreased quite remarkably over the last 2 decades, primarily because Boise Cascade closed their plant. So they not only lost Latinos, they lost everybody. The whole population declined. But you see places with rapid growth. This is percent of total population that is Latino by county in the 2010 census. And in smaller counties, again, the percentage may be a little larger, but you have, if you look at the table over here, and I'm not sure if you can see that even as big as it is on the screen, a small county like Nobles County in southwestern Minnesota, and that county seat is Worthington, 22.5% of the population is Latino. It's even higher within the city of Worthington itself. So you have these concentrations in these places where the percentage of Latino is quite high. We have a much larger number in Hennepin County, but Hennepin County has over 1 million people in it, so it's a smaller percentage. So be aware of that. But the project that we've been talking about, we intend to post this data to the internet site of the Chicano Latino Affairs Council, so you can compare both numbers and percentages. We're just giving you an overview here. This is by tract. And you can see that certain areas, census tract is a division of the county with approximately 4,000 to 5,000 people. So all of the tracts are approximately the same size population-wise. But you can see that the highest percentages, some of them are in Hennepin County. Nobles County has the second and the third highest percentage of Latino people. And again, that's Worthington in southwestern Minnesota. Swift has a packing plant there. Has drawn Latinos for years and years and years. We did some, when I was working at the State Demographic Center in 1996 and 97, we actually did some field research, which was pretty unusual for us. But we looked at Worthington and Nobles County, and we talked to people why the population turnaround had occurred. And my colleague Martha McMurray, who was doing the research in Nobles County, met with several Latino workers from Swift and asked them how they learned about Worthington, and they said, and I don't recall what city they were from in Mexico, but they told her that everybody in their city knew about Worthington, that that was a place to come and find a job. So, and we know about immigrant chains, and somebody came here and they send a letter back and say it's a good place to come, so more and more people come from that area. And that certainly happened in Worthington. Worthington since has attracted Lao people as well as Somalis and Ethiopians, all working in that area. This is by city, and the circles in this, I'm sorry, this map doesn't appear to be very clear, but you see the darker green circles indicate a higher percentage of Latinos in those cities. So you see Worthington standing out, as well as places like St. James and Medalia in Watonwan County in south central Minnesota. Also places like Wilmer is kind of in the middle, central middle part of the state. Moorhead, Grand Forks, East Grand Forks rather, because Grand Forks is in North Dakota and we don't worry about them. But, and so the one thing about the Latino population, and I'm sure you've probably already noticed this on these maps, is that they're not found in northeastern Minnesota. And as you heard this noon, immigrants come where there's work. Immigrants don't come for welfare. That's just a bunch of baloney, but they come to work. Northeastern Minnesota hasn't had jobs to speak of for a long time, with the downturn in the taconite industry and just a general downturn overall in northeastern Minnesota has meant that they haven't had as many immigrants come to that part of the state as for places like southern Minnesota where there have been jobs and a labor force shortage. That didn't occur in Northeast, and so you don't have very many Latinos in that part of the state. This is just a table, which I know you can't read. I have a name for this kind of chart, and I apologize for it. Next. When we count people in the census, we ask people who are Asian or American Indian or Latino to tell us what their background is or their origin, country of origin. This doesn't mean that they were born in that country. It means that they consider themselves Mexican or Indian or Filipino or Cherokee. And for Latinos in Minnesota, about 70% are Mexican, 4.3% are Puerto Rican, and so on. Really, obviously, very much dominated by Mexicans in Minnesota, and this is both American-born and Mexican-born people. And if you want to look at it in a chart, and the same thing here, we have the numbers there. So about 176,000 Minnesota Latinos are Mexican origin. Okay. Now, this is another thing that we have to remember. Remember that 176,000 number of Mexican Latinos in Minnesota. 63,985 Mexican Latinos were born in Mexico. So that means that about a third of Mexican Latinos in Minnesota were born outside the country. And that's important to recognize, because when we talk about undocumented, I think it's very easy to overestimate the number of unauthorized Mexicans or Latinos in our state. But if you look at the number who are born outside the country, and they're the only ones who can be unauthorized, to come up with some of the estimates that you see, probably twice as many have to be born outside the United States than actually show up in census data. If we add into that, or we take into consideration undercounts, I still don't think we can come up with some of the estimates that we see in the literature. You'll see a higher percentage born outside the country in more recent groups, including Salvadorans, Guatemalans, Ecuadorians, and so on. Well, this is your part. And back to the Mexican comedian.
I wish I would be a good comedian, but
This is a funny part.
it is not. Yeah, just going back to the previous slide, we are just listing there Latino people who are born outside of the country. So, but you see, Mexicans represent 18, almost 19% of the entire immigrant community in the state, being the first number. I mean, it is the largest number of immigrants in the entire state in this estimation. After that came Laos, and then Vietnam, and then Somalia. So just for you to notice that the latest number of immigrants come from Guatemala, and representing only 1.3% of the entire immigrants in the state. So, and I want to follow to the next slide. It is interesting that regardless this kind of small proportion of immigrants in the state, Latinos in general are not doing really well in school. For example, their performance is really low. And the graduation rate for Latinos in high school goes very low, even below 32%, an estimation shows. And Latinos are also kind of not allowed to go to college, and not necessarily just because the undocumented status, which is important, but it's also because they don't reach a economic stability for them to send their children to school, to college. And that is a big problem. Also, the health insurance coverage among Latinos is very low.
They arrive to this country, as many of Norwegian and German, they arrive as immigrants, they are more likely to take risk and try to use the social network to create an ethnic economy. So in the U.S., 27,000 plus businesses are small business. There is a high dynamic of small businesses in the U.S. in general. So, for instance, 49% of the small businesses closed in 5 years, and 31 survived at least 7 years. So small businesses have the good thing about create opportunity to many, individuals, but at the same time, there's a lot of turnover. They're returning, a lot of firms closing down and opening. So there is a lot of job destruction and job creation at the same time. And that's the dynamic of this group, is what creates also the dynamic of the economy in the U.S. Even during the downturn, even during the recession, some new business were created, small business were created, and at the same time, obviously, small business were destroyed or closed down. Between 60 and 80% of all new jobs come from small business. So that's interesting. New jobs are created mostly from small business. Latinos in the entire U.S., almost 25% of all entrepreneurs in the U.S., they are the engine of economic development, job creation, product service, value of diversity, and neighborhood cohesion. And this of neighborhood cohesion is like, now when you have new businesses creating small businesses, so offering services to the community, people don't have to move and transport, use different ways to go to the cities. Now they have services and diversity in the local area. So that also creates a more cohesion and connection among the neighbors in the area. So in the entire map of the U.S., Minnesota it has a growth between 21 and 42% of Hispanic-owned firms between 2002 and 2007, and this is from the survey of small of owners of small businesses. At the same time, the payroll increased. If you look at the Minnesota and you look at the whole map, obviously, when we talk about Latinos, we can always concentrate on California, Florida, Texas, and New York. But still, Minnesota has a large increment on participation of small businesses in general. And then part of the small businesses now looking at Minnesota as its own, Minnesota's Hispanic-owned businesses are mostly non-employer. So that's one thing. I've talked about a lot of job creation, but obviously there is a lot of, well, obviously not. There is a lot of transition to most of the time, a small business when it's created is a non-employer business, and then after that becomes, after some years, become employer. So there is a lot of transition between these two stages. But most of the employers are 85%, or most of the small businesses, 85% are non-employers. Mostly Hispanic, mostly Mexican. We just talked about how many of the Latinos are Mexican. There are only 1,000 Venezuelans. I'm from Venezuela, in Minnesota. So, and I know maybe 50 of them. That's it. And the other interesting thing, if you divide and you mix ethnicity with race, most of the Mexican consider themselves white. So Mexican white, 92% on business. And in terms of payroll, and this is very interesting because one of the things in Minnesota, even though the number is not very big, we talk about a little bit over 5,000 businesses, small businesses. The payroll and the sales are very high in terms of the payroll, sorry, because I just said a non-employer. The sales are very high, and the growth rate of sales compared to 2002 was around 200% improvement. So these businesses, even though they've been non-employer, they're growing very fast. But I'm going to tell you something about the limitations, because this sounds a pretty good story, but obviously we have some limitations here, because why would we be a company being owned by Latin Americans? One thing is that they tend to concentrate in low growth and no growth economic sector. I mean, construction, so very small size businesses. Though others receive, even though at the national level mostly. As you said, we have to pay employees, even though they're growing. And according to the Minneapolis Federal Reserve, they have issues of big barriers or limitations with poor or limited credit history, fear of government establishment institutions, limited access to the tax number. Some banks allow to give people credit without social security number, but many banks in Minnesota don't. So it depends on which part of the culture inside the area. Long distances between businesses, business and service providers mostly in the Twin Cities. So opening a new business and the rural area of northern or south, it's still people have to move on to this towards the city to get some of the services. And the last one is very interesting because even this business, it seems that they start very small, and then they start growing in terms of sales and receipts. But there is a lack of merging or strategic alliances among the company. So it becomes self-employed, this is my own business, family-owned, and the history of family-owned, and then after that, it's very hard to see a bunch of Latin Americans creating a large business, creating new employment. So that's one of the things that we don't see, and this is not only Minnesota. I think this is at the national level. In terms of most of the successful creating new branches or franchises, all this kind of strategy in business, they lack of that, those characteristics. In rural areas, there is a lot of programs on rural enterprise center, with agricultural training. For farmers, there's a lot of finance and loan programs for the rural Minnesota and small areas. The Southern Minnesota Initiative Foundation and Kellogg Foundation and the small SBA, those programs, they created new ones just in February, the small loan advantage program and the community advantage program by LECD and Joanna is not here. They get this very small loan programs, especially in rural areas. They try to concentrate now in areas outside the Twin Cities where they have been concentrated before. There is a new bill passing around, I don't know if it passed or not because I haven't updated this. Immigrant and Minority Mutual Loan Program introduced in February 2012 to the Agricultural and Rural Economic Committee, and it's all the creation of the programs for small areas in Minnesota, especially rural areas in Minnesota. This is a very hot topic right now. Well, hot topic I mean at least there is a bill and there is a movement inside the Congress right now. So now that was a little bit fast. But I want to give you time to ask questions because there is a lot of fairly interesting questions that are out there. And some of you may know this very well, and some of you is new. So if I'm talking too fast, you can just raise your hand and I try to stop. Now in terms of health, it's a completely separate topic, but it's what I'm working on. Hispanic Latinos in Minnesota have the highest number of uninsured rate, almost 25%, compared to blacks, American Indian, Asian, all the other groups. And that has been very high, they reduced the uninsured proportion from 31 to 25%, but it's still very high. There is a lot of complexity. And one of the complexity is that it's not that, I'm getting a lot of numbers here, but I'm going to tell you this. It's not that there is this group is uninsured and they're healthy, and that's why many of them, they are using their services, I'm using their services, is that there are particularities in what is the whole story of an immigrant or another culture coming here and eating a different type of food, having a different type of lifestyle. One of the leading cause of that for Latin Americans is diabetes. And they're 2.5 times greater than Asian Americans and non-Hispanic whites. In addition to that, they do have, and I try to put it in black and bold, they tend to have more years. Longevity is very interesting in this group. They tend to live longer than African Americans and other groups, and American Indians, which are the other minority groups. At the same time, there is a large rate of infant mortality. Let me just tell you about the myth, lack of usual critical care. 30% of Hispanic and Latin usual critical care. And if they have a critical care, they use multiple critical care. Also, and this is very sad, diagnosis and treatment. We find that from the data out there, the percentage of hospitalized children with asthma given prescription for preventive medicine. Hispanic only 2%, black 7%, compared to white 21%. We're talking about preventive care. Now breast cancer, black and Hispanic have to wait twice as long as a white between an abnormal screening and a diagnosis. Twice as long. This is about preventive care. This is not even about the actual treatment, diagnosis. So mortality disparity ratio, most of the Hispanic in Minnesota die because of motor vehicle accident. Well, you have to see how I drive and maybe you understand that. Unintentional injury and diabetes. So sugar will very sweet. What to do? Data collection, publicly available. Publicly available because I think the data is like that. And we don't have access to it. Praise, ethnicity, and language. Tracking of health status progress. Every time you go online and you try to put immigrant and any topic, you find all these great reports about how much data they have, they're going to do, all these things they're going to do during the following year. And then you look at the year of the project, 1997, 2005, and like, how is it all these things hasn't happened in 6 years or 10 years? So yeah, there's a lot of problems out there. There's a lot of things that they've been talking about, creating community services, networks, especially workforce, a lot about the health system, but I don't see the numbers. I don't see the assessment. I don't see the tracking of those projects, the status of those projects. So now we have this page for my students, and I gave you, as you saw, it was a snapshot of health and self-employment Latinos, and we have the story of Latinos in Minnesota. So if you have any questions, we have 5 minutes left. My mom was the one who started the whole thing. So any question, you want to come here? Any questions? Questions? Was embarrassing? I thought. Yeah, we have a question.
Yeah, you said that a lot of Latinos have mistrust of government and government agencies. Do you have any ideas of what the government can do to make more trust to help them start businesses?
Do you mean that having better services in the cities?
No, I mean the government agencies. You said Latinos that start businesses often don't trust.
Oh, that was me. That was
Yeah.
me.
Oh,
that was me. Yes. The thing is that to go through, to do all the administrative process, you do have to have some kind of language skills. And not only language skill of knowing how to speak English, it's like know how to, the how to. And it's like which office you have to go, you know that. But then how to deal with the administrative or state employees, it's quite different from our countries to this country. Then people start losing their, what the word will be, like, enthusiasm of going through all that. It's not as problematic as it is in our country, but it's the lack of knowing, the cultural lack of knowing how to, what it makes, create a lack of trust. Not trust of not believing in the institution, but more of how to deal with the institution and all the paperwork will be involved.
Is it true that you carpool?
Yeah, no, I used to.
Oh, then we do have to work, because then you're driving every day. So if you're driving a couple of days a week. Because in your carpool, at least we have to say. I'm noticing with the data, because you're pulling the health and the economic data, and have you looked, or is there someone looking and talking about the connection between low insurance coverage for Latinos, but also the choice of Latinos to be entrepreneurs themselves and not be part of larger companies or big industry? Something that effect where it might be, and they don't employ a lot of people, so they never get a chance to go big enough to get a good insurance package for their business. I wonder if there's something.
I've done that through the national, I'm working on that connection, especially for part of the self-employment movement is people want to provide for themselves. They want to have salary, and then also it will create opportunity for that person, especially because not getting a job could also be connected to not getting health insurance. So then if you get your self-employment, you also want to create a business that can pay for that other part of the life, which is health insurance. So I've been working very initial on the national level. With Minnesota data, there's a lot of issues of getting access to it. I've been a year trying to get access to race and ethnicity data.
Yes, very quickly. There's an example. The Latino Economic Development Center has a study on that. It's available, so you can just ask to
Oh,
the
yeah,
internet.
yeah,
We work on that, and you'll find very interesting kind of data there.
Just because we have a very, well, we have a conference panel rather just starting right now, we have a very big crowd, it looks like, out there coming, looking for, to come into this room, so I think if we could kindly try to facilitate that. And certainly feel free to continue your conversation with the